In this video, I will go into more detail about your first essay, the comparative analysis of two short stories essay. The first item I want you to think about is the thesis statement. As an academic essay, all of the writing is what we call thesis driven, which means that everything in the essay is supporting whatever your thesis statement is. So let's take a look at your thesis statement first and make sure it's addressing the components of our prompt. So we have three components in our prompt. The first one is you have to be comparing two stories, or you could have two poems, or you could have a poem and short story. So any combination of the comparison of the primary works. Your essay should demonstrate your understanding of the elements of fiction. So just briefly, the main ones we've looked at are plot and structure, character, setting, point of view. We haven't looked into too much detail on language and style, but you're welcome to look at that. We haven't looked at theme yet, and then irony and symbol. You are also looking at some of those additional literary elements on the literarydevices.net page, and those are all available for you to use as points of analysis in this essay as well. Just a quick tip, using language like take your author's last name. So here I have Garcia Marquez. Uses symbol might create a smoother sentence structure. So taking whatever your author's name is and using a verb and then put in your literary element might make your sentence structure a little bit smoother. And the last point is the point of the thesis, the argument, should say something about the human condition. Try not to actually use that phrase, human condition. It's rather clunky, but actually name the condition. So difficulty for married couples to communicate after the death of a loved one. That's an example of the human condition, and it's much more specific than just saying the human condition. Or another element of the human condition might be something like the problem soldiers face when their duty as a soldier collides with their duties as human beings. So when you get to this part of your thesis about the human condition, don't use that language, human condition, but rather say what element of the human condition you're actually going to be discussing in the essay. Okay, so make sure your thesis has all of these things in there, that it's obvious that you're comparing two stories, that it's obvious that you understand the different elements of fiction and how they function in the story, and that you're suggesting something about the human condition. All right, let's take a look at some sample thesis statements. So what I have here is a weak thesis, and I think most of you will read that and agree with me that it is terrible. This paper will discuss the main characters of A Rose for Emily by William Faulkner and The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. There's no argument there. It's just a statement of what the paper is going to do, and it's not even that much of a elaboration. It just says we'll discuss instead of really discussing specifically what the paper is going to be arguing. So a stronger thesis statement might be something like in William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily and Charlotte Perkins Gilman's The Yellow Wallpaper, the authors use point of view and irony to illustrate how the protagonists are victims of family and society. So it's much more specific here. We have here our elements of fiction, point of view and irony, and we have the human condition, victims of family and society. So that's much stronger. Okay, we have two different types of thesis. We could either create an open form thesis or a closed form thesis. Now, I'm sure you all are familiar with these two types of thesis statements, although you might not have had these labels open and closed to describe them. So let's just briefly talk about what these two forms are. The closed form thesis statement is something that we see a lot in maybe not as crafted writing. So what happens in the closed form thesis statement is that the thesis itself contains each one of the points that the paper is going to be discussing. So here we have the first point, victims of their close relationships. That's going to, of course, have to be the first paragraph that's going to be discussed. The second one, victims of their larger families. That's going to be the next point that's going to be discussed in the essay. And there we would have that as our next topic sentence. And then of societal norms. And again, that would have to be the third body paragraph. When we use the closed form thesis statement, we've created a map here, and this map has to be followed. So we have to show close relationships first, and then we have to develop larger families, and then we have to develop societal norms. So the essay has to follow that same order. As a thesis statement goes, the closed form is not as sophisticated, and I think most people kind of instinctually feel that that's not a very sophisticated structure. So in this level of writing, we're in a 201 class, so we want to go for the more sophisticated thesis statement. So here we have our closed form thesis, and we just move it to an open form. And so what we do when we move it to an open form, you'll notice here how rather than talking about each one of these, what I've called individual, what I call prongs, so these different points that are going to be made in subsequent paragraphs, we've just compressed those ideas into one larger idea. Here are victims of external forces they cannot control. So rather than calling out each one of these external forces, we just label them as external forces, and then we have our open form thesis statement. Just a brief side note, the reason why we call this closed and this one open, this is closed because once the reader reads this thesis statement, the topic is more or less closed down. We know exactly what's going to happen in the rest of the essay. It's going to follow each one of these points, and each one of those points are going to get their own paragraphs. Open form, on the other hand, we don't have that very much closed down structure for our readers. After our readers read this thesis statement, they're not sure exactly what you're going to talk about, except for that they are victims of external forces. So that's why we label these things closed versus open. This open one leaves more room here for readers to kind of explore what these external forces might be as the writer develops it. Okay. How do we do this? So we want to go for the more sophisticated. Say you have a closed form right now and you'd like to revise it into an open form thesis statement. It's quite a simple process. Isolate those prongs. So whatever your points are, I have 3 here. Sometimes we have 2, sometimes we have 4. So it just kind of depends on your assignment length and the thoughts you have. And so there isn't a kind of a magic number of 3. It's just kind of what I ended up with here. You might have 2, 3, 4. It just kind of depends on the assignment. But anyway, locate those individual prongs and then brainstorm what is a phrase or a word that you could use that could kind of hold all of those ideas together, what I call an umbrella phrase. And so here I just revised it to external forces they cannot control. Okay, once we have our open form thesis statement, our level 1 unity becomes really, really important. And this idea of repeating the key term to really kind of weave together your topic sentences so that they're all working in cohesion to develop your thesis statement. So once we have revised our thesis statement into an open form. Here we revised it to external forces they cannot control. Now this language, external forces, becomes our key term. And we want to weave that key term into each one of our topic sentences. And thereby we create good, strong unity between each one of our topic sentences and the thesis statement. So let's take a look at our example here. So one external force that victimizes the protagonist is their close relationship. Family members are another powerful force. So again, really highlighting that force as my key term that suppresses the protagonist. And then finally, perhaps the most pernicious force placed upon the protagonist is that of societal norms. So when you are revising your skeletal structure here, and by skeletal structure I mean your thesis statement and your topic sentences. And if you're doing this sophisticated open form thesis statement and you've identified your key term and you've woven that in there, once you start revising your topic sentences to get that key term in each one of them, you should also be thinking about the actual presentation of paragraph concepts. And so you'll notice here what I did is I went from kind of least extreme to most extreme. So there should be some sort of logic for why this paragraph comes ahead of this one and why this is the last paragraph. So you can use your key terms to help kind of underscore for your readers the reason why you've placed your paragraph ideas in the order that you've presented them. So that is really kind of playing with our overall skeletal structure, and I really encourage you, if you haven't done so, to use open form thesis statements. Okay, as a general organizational structure for comparative work, comparative essays can get very messy, and so it's really important that you have a very clear organizational pattern. For this particular assignment, you guys have a lot of moving parts. So you have the point that the story's making, so the human condition point. You're also looking at fictional elements, so you're going to have that aspect of your essay, and of course you've got two stories. So here we've got lots of different concepts that can kind of really create a messy situation. So it's really important to decide how you'd like to kind of highlight or focus each one of those different requirements from the essay prompt. So there are basically three big ways that you can organize this essay. If you have another idea, feel free to go with it. These are just the general ways that we would organize an essay with a prompt like this. So you could organize it by point, and with point, then each topic sentence would, in this case, be focused on the point of close relationships, the point about larger family, and the point about societal pressures. And then within that paragraph, we would talk about Faulkner and then the fictional element here, point of view and irony. And then we could talk about Perkins and then point of view and irony. So we would separate our authors here. We'd have our paragraph focusing on the point, and then we talk about one author and then the fictional elements, and then another author and the fictional elements. And then we would repeat that same structure in the subsequent paragraphs. So if we started with Faulkner in this paragraph and point of view, we would want to continue on that pattern as we move through the rest of the paragraphs. You wouldn't want to start with Perkins and irony here. It would really start to make things confusing for the reader. So you want to establish a pattern for your reader in each one of the paragraphs so that it's more easy for them to focus on your concepts and not so much trying to understand where they are in the paragraph structure itself. Okay, so that's the first one, organizing by point. Another way you could organize this essay is by the fictional element. So in this case, we could look at point of view first. So we would do one paragraph on Faulkner's point of view, and then how that point of view impacts the close relationships or is illustrated through the close relationships, the larger family, and societal pressures, what in this example were our different points. Then we could look at Perkins with point of view, and again look at those three concepts: close relationships, larger family, societal pressures. Again, note that I'm kind of repeating that same pattern. I don't want to put societal pressures before larger family. I want to keep that same pattern. And then I could look at Faulkner with irony, Perkins with irony, and again kind of follow that same pattern. So that's by the fictional element. Our final way, and one little caveat with this, it's generally the least successful way, is to organize it by story. So you could look at Faulkner first, and here we have three paragraphs on Faulkner, one focusing on close relationship with point of view and irony, one on larger family, point of view and irony, one on societal pressures, point of view and irony. And then we could focus on Perkins, and we would follow that same pattern, starting with close relationships, larger family, and then the last point would be on societal pressures, looking at point of view and irony. The reason why I say this is the least successful of the three methods is because we really end up with kind of two chunks. We look at Faulkner first, and then we look at Perkins. And there's not as much integration as we're seeing. You can see of these three organizational patterns, the most integrated kind is the first one, where we're actually seeing really lots of strong comparison here within the paragraph itself. Notice this one, we have separate paragraphs on each author. It's more integrated because at least I'm toggling back and forth between Faulkner and Perkins. Whereas in this one, it almost kind of feels like you're just isolating each individual story. So that's why this final pattern usually isn't as successful, because it kind of feels like two little mini essays that are kind of repeating each other. So just some stuff to think about as you are starting to structure your essay and to figure out how you'd like to present your different concepts. Okay, This slide here is just to emphasize those concepts that we talked about with level 1 and level 2 unity. If you don't remember those, go back into the previous week's lecture and take a look at the lectures about level 1 and level 2 unity. Those are probably new concepts for you. If you've never had me as a teacher before, those are probably new concepts for you. These two concepts, level 1 and level 2 unity,